So welcome back to chapter 14. So what is the impact of poverty? So here we can see a clinic in Ghana, and we know that clinics such as these may not be accessible to many people in the developing world, and lack of immunizations and treatment for infections and other illnesses results in an increase in infectious disease and a decrease in survival rates from chronic diseases such as cancer. Lack of health care can also increase infant mortality, so again that's infant death rates, and increase the incidence of low birth weight babies. On the right, those are young Indonesian girls working in a textile factory rather than going to school, and lack of education prevents people from escaping poverty and contributes to undernutrition and disease because it leads to inadequate care for infants, children, and pregnant women. So what about overpopulation? When this exists in a region where there are more people than its natural resources can support. So we know that like a fertile river valley can support more people per acre than a desert environment. But even in fertile regions of the world, if the number of people increases excessively, resources are overwhelmed, and food shortages occur. At present, enough food is produced throughout the world to prevent hunger if that food is distributed equitably, but demand is rising. And the human population is currently growing, and this rate of growth could eventually outstrip the planet's ability to produce enough food or to nourish the world's food. Also, we know that overpopulation puts stress on food production methods, and we know that there's searches for new energy sources, and these affect our ability to feed the world's populations. For example, more grain-intensive livestock production and the recent acceleration in the use of grain to produce ethanol to fuel cars has increased the demand for grain. And this increased demand has contributed to dramatic increases in food prices, which have made it even more challenging for low and middle income families worldwide to obtain enough food. And the rising price of grain and fuel oil has also reduced the amount of food aid, widening the gap between the amount of food available and the amount of food needed to meet nutritional needs. Here's a graph that shows about 90% of the world's population growth is occurring in less developed countries, and developing countries can't escape poverty because their economies can't pace with such rapid population growth, and efforts to produce enough food can damage the soil and deplete environmental resources, further reducing the capacity to produce food in the future. Cultural practices, we know in some cultures access may be limited for certain individuals and households. For example, because they're viewed as less important, women and girls may receive less food than men and boys. So how much food is available to an individual within a household depends on their gender, their control of income, their education, age, birth order, and genetic endowments. Cultural acceptability or unacceptability of foods also contributes to food shortages and undernutrition. If the available foods are culturally unacceptable, a food shortage can exist unless the population can be educated to accept the new food. For example, insects are eaten in some cultures and are excellent sources of protein, but in other cultures they are unacceptable sources of food. Again, the concept of limited environmental resources, the land and other resources available to produce food are limited, and some resources such as minerals and fossil fuels are present in only a limited amount and are non-renewable. That means once they've been used, they can't be replaced within a reasonable amount of time. Other things like soil and water are renewable resources because they will be available indefinitely if they're used at a rate at which the earth can restore them. So, for example, when agriculture land is used wisely, that is, when crops are rotated, erosion is prevented, and contamination is limited, and it can be reused almost endlessly. However, if the land is not used carefully, damage caused by soil erosion, nutrient depletion, and accumulation of pollutants may reduce the amount of usable land over the long term. When we talk about modern mechanized agricultural methods, we know they've increased our food production, but use more energy and resources than more traditional labor-intensive farming. And large-scale farming can erode the soil and deplete the nutrients. Lots of conversations now about fertilizer and pesticides and how they can contaminate groundwater and eventually pollute waterways. And we do see that in many areas. And if a product is shipped over long distances, the energy for refrigeration or freezing or processing adds to the environmental costs of that food product. And as more countries are undergoing that nutrition transition that we were talking about, the demand for meat-based diets increases, and this increases the use of natural resources and energy. And in general, the environmental cost of producing a plant-based diet or foods is lower than that of producing animal products. So raising cattle creates both air and water pollution. The animals themselves produce methane, a greenhouse gas, in their GI tracts. Large-scale factory farming makes the problem worse because more methane is produced when animal sewage is stored in ponds and in heaps. And in fact, livestock is responsible for a large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions than all the cars in the world combined. And many people don't know that. Livestock production can also account for over 8% of global human water use and releases nutrients and pathogens and other pollutants into waterways. And it is not only the resources of the land that are at risk, but population growth has increased the demand for fish to the point that the Earth's oceans are being depleted as well. And this slide kind of goes into that as well. So the environmental impact on oceans, I think we hear a lot more about that here in Florida, that overfishing has severely reduced the number of many marine species, and pollution also threatens the world's fishing grounds. Oil spills and deliberate dumping occur offshore, and sewage, pesticides, organic pollutants, and sediments from erosion wash into coastal waters where most fish spend at least part of their lives. And even aquaculture, designed to increase fish production, produces waste that can pollute ocean water and harm other marine organisms. So what about poor quality diets? Even where there's enough food, malnutrition can occur if the quality of the diet is important, and I think a lot of you saw that in your food diaries. The typical diet in developing countries is based on high fiber grain products or root vegetables and has little variety, and adults who are able to consume a relatively large amount of this diet may be able to meet their nutrient needs, but individuals with high nutrient needs because they're ill or pregnant or with limited capacity to consume this bulky grain diet, such as children and elderly individuals, they're at risk for nutrient deficiencies. And deficiencies of protein, iron, iodine, vitamin A are common with poor quality diets. And here we can see some different types of protein and micronutrient deficiencies. So protein energy malnutrition is one of the most common in children. And when there's a general lack of food, the wasting associated with marasmus, which is on the left where they look like a skeleton, and that's when there's not enough starchy grains and vegetables, not enough carbohydrates. And kwashiorkor is on the right. That's characterized by a bloated belly, and that's predominantly seen when there's just a lack of protein in the diet, maybe a lot of starchy grains, but no protein. And other factors, such as metabolic changes caused by infection, can play a role in the development of kwashiorkor as well. Protein and micronutrient deficiencies. So we know that more than 2 billion people worldwide suffer from iron deficiency anemia, and that's characterized by these small pale red blood cells, and the lack of iron in their diet reduces the amount of hemoglobin produced, and the lack of hemoglobin lowers the blood's ability to deliver oxygen. And in developing countries, intestinal parasites, which cause GI blood loss and acute chronic infections such as malaria, increase the risk and severity of dietary iron deficiency. And we know that iron deficiency has a major impact on the health and productivity of a population. Here is a picture on the left of a woman with goiter, and that's a manifestation of iodine deficiency. It can reduce a person's mental performance and work capacity, and iodine deficient children have poor IQs and impaired school performance. And in adults, it's associated with apathy and decreased initiative and problems with decision making. On the right, we can see a picture of vitamin A deficiency leading to xerophthalmia. And we know that this is common in preschool children worldwide who suffer vitamin A deficiency, and it can lead to blindness among children, and it can decrease people's immune function, increasing their risk of illness and death from infections, especially if they get something like the measles or diarrhea, which would normally cause death, but because of the nutrient deficiencies, it puts them at further risk. Okay, so what about the United States? What are some of the causes of the hunger in the United States? So most of the nutritional problems in the U.S. are related to overnutrition. However, there's about 15% of households in the United States who experience food insecurity. And normally this is not caused by a general food shortage in our population, but by inequitable distribution of food and money. And the incidence of hunger and food insecurity is highest among women, infants, and children, elderly, and those who are poor, homeless, ill, or disabled. But we do know that a sudden decrease in income or an increase in living expenses can put anyone at risk for food insecurity, and decrease access to some healthier foods. People are living off the dollar menu at McDonald's and that sort of thing, and buying as little food as possible. Food insecurity in the United States. This is a graph that just shows current data of the percent of the population that doesn't have normal eating patterns, where food intake was reduced because they didn't have enough money to obtain food, or eating patterns are reduced, and they eat the same foods every day, just rice, maybe canned foods. They're getting food from emergency or community pantries. And the term food desert is kind of a newer concept that it's out in the last decade or so, and that's an area that lacks access to affordable foods that make up a healthy diet. So that's where the community or the population doesn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, complex carbohydrates, low-fat milk. High real estate prices in inner cities have driven supermarkets to the suburbs. So they live on small convenience stores in the cities that charge exorbitant amounts for food, and they're far from rural areas and migrant worker labor camps where they have access to affordable food. Lack of education is a cause or consequence of poverty. Educational opportunities, they don't understand food choices, food safety, home economics. They're deficient in energy and nutrients. Obesity is calming, and it prevents access to higher paying jobs. And we'll stop here till